is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello, I'm Anton, and this is The Heat. U.S. President Joe Biden hosts his first state dinner with French President Emmanuel Macron. The two leaders met earlier to discuss the Ukraine conflict, trade cooperation, space, cyberspace, and the ever-growing energy concerns in Europe. The touchiest topic, though, the terms of the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. Signed into law this past summer, passage of the multi-billion-dollar package was a hard-fought win for the Biden administration, but it does include massive green subsidies that Europeans say could put their manufacturers at a disadvantage. On Thursday, Biden said tweaks may be possible to help level the playing field. We begin with this report from CGTN's Nathan King.
So the first state visit in the Biden administration goes to France. There's lots of questions why. Remember, France was in a very difficult position after the AUKUS deal was announced, where Australia dumped its submarine deal with Paris in favor of nuclear submarine technology with the US and the UK. They even recall their ambassador, Paris, from here, Washington. Well, that might be part of the reason, but also, let's face it, things have changed since then, since the war over Ukraine and the conflict in Ukraine, and the fact that France and the US is much closer when it comes to its attitude towards Moscow, even though Macron was criticized here in the US for pushing diplomacy before the outbreak of hostilities back in February. There's also hope that Macron might be able to play some sort of role for the Europeans and for everyone else globally in the coming months if the conflict doesn't resolve and it gets moved towards diplomacy. But underneath this sort of oldest ally sort of rhetoric and closest, one of the closest allies, there are deep differences, especially when it comes to U.S. economic policy in the Inflation Reduction Act, in the CHIPS Act, even in the Infrastructure Act. Essentially, this Made in America proviso that runs through it. Essentially, when it comes to the industries of the future, we're talking about electric vehicles, we're talking about semiconductor. There's a real feeling that Europe's being left out, that France is being left out, that the provisions in the bills give tax-free status to Canada and Mexico, but not close partners on the other side of the Atlantic. Now, there is a working group to go through this. Both countries say they hope they can work through their differences.
This morning, we're going to discuss our cooperation on all the issues from high-tech commerce to defense to cyber to space to a whole range of issues that are on both of our agendas.
Because we want to fix the direct and indirect consequences of the war on our economies and our people. But at the same time, we want to prepare for future generations. A carbon neutral economy, creating a lot of jobs, which means investing a lot in our economies, and we have to synchronize our action on this issue.
But it goes deeper than that, because of course Europe is bearing the brunt when it comes to the effects of the conflict in Ukraine, especially when it comes to higher energy prices, higher inflation to here in the US. They feel that the US economy may be bounding back, but the European economy is being left behind. The US, of course, is energy independent. But there is a feeling diplomatically here that Emmanuel Macron, having got re-election, having become closer to this administration at the expense perhaps of Berlin because of Angela Merkel leaving the chancellorship and Olaf Scholz coming in, that Macron and France can bat above its weight a little bit when it comes to the US. A lot of the differences have been sort of brushed under the carpet here, but no real solutions going forward. But they are closer than they have been, largely due to Moscow's actions in Ukraine. Nathan King, CGTN, just outside the White House.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from France, Joav Toker is an assistant professor at the American Graduate School in Paris. Here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin joins us. He is a professor of history at American University. From Vancouver in Canada, Aaron Maté is the host of the show Pushback with Aaron Maté on the Grayzone. And from Maryland, we're joined by Michael O'Hanlon. He is a senior fellow and director of research in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Michael O'Hanlon, let me start with you. This meeting comes at a time when, in the words of the New York Times, there are growing tensions between Europe and the United States. In fact, President Macron, before he started his meeting with President Biden, had some very tough words. He said Biden's domestic agenda, and that was a specific reference to the Inflation Reduction Act, but that agenda could, quote, fragment the West. How deep is this transatlantic schism, and to what extent is this meeting meant to bridge that divide?
Greetings. Well, I think it is a serious issue in transatlantic relations because, as you know, it gets to the heart of economic competitiveness, and every Western leader is essentially being hired by his or her electorate to deal with the economy first and foremost. That's always the top issue in almost any country at any time. The exception, of course, being when you're so worried about your security that you have to prioritize that. So to give some perspective, as long as Vladimir Putin and Russia are waging war against Ukraine, issuing the occasional nuclear threat against other countries, including the West, and trying to freeze the West into a cold winter of submission by cutting off energy, you're going to have a certain amount of cohesion within NATO. And by the way, we might have noted this is a state dinner that President Biden has invited President Macron to be honored at during a state visit, which has also included other nice pleasantries and engagements. So they're not at sword's length. If they were, they would not be having these kinds of pleasant encounters and, celebrations of the alliance. So I would say, to finally answer your question, maybe put it on a scale of 1 to 10, the tension's somewhere around a 4 or a 5 right now. It's not at an 8 or a 10.
Michael, one other point which our reporter Nathan King raised at the beginning of his report, why Macron and why now?
It's a hard question to answer definitively. You did, again, the reporting was very good. I thought referring back to last year's troubles, the AUKUS deal, where the U.S. was seen as largely pulling the rug out from under the French, and perhaps that was a fair criticism. There was therefore some damage to repair. Also, Macron has become in some ways now the elder statesman of Western Europe and of the European arm of NATO, and certainly the EU, with Britain out of the EU, with both Britain and Germany now having new governments. And Macron being now the seasoned old guy, eminence grise, even though he's still in his mid-40s and still a very young man. But I think that has to be part of it. But there are probably other factors, too, that I'm sure the other guests may want to add to my list.
Right. Joav, Toker, there are sharp differences between the United States and France on U.S. domestic trade policy, economic policy, particularly the Inflation Reduction Act. Brussels says it in fact breaches international trade rules. Here's President Macron. Let's listen.
The Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act are choices that will fragment the West because they create such differences between the United States of America and Europe that all those who work in many companies in the US, they will just think we don't make investments anymore on the other side of the Atlantic.
So, Joav, what do you think is the message that President Macron brought to President Biden?
Well, I think the term that President Macron used a few hours ago was actually that of synchronization. I don't think there is, beyond rhetoric, any illusion on the French or European side, for that matter, that President Biden or any other American president, for that matter, would alter the policy which is that much at the heart of the White House overall social, economic, development, geostrategic efforts, namely perceiving the major challenge coming from the direction of China, realizing the thing to do is to industrialize in a very potent way American capabilities. And yes, indeed, the Americans are there, the Chinese are there, and the Europeans are there. They are playing in the same game. They are weaker, of course, relatively speaking, in comparison to the Americans and the Chinese. These are the rules of the game. These are actually the rules of reality. So when President Macron said 3 times, I believe, this afternoon, synchronization between what we in Europe are doing and what you in America are doing in a way that we would not be hurt beyond necessary, and there could be a pursuit of what we're doing together, because we're doing together so many important things that will be in the economic and mainly in the geostrategic domain. How would that synchronization look like is, of course, the major question. And for example, once President Macron leaves the United States tomorrow, his super minister of the Treasury and Economy will stay in Washington and try to work out some of the details which would give the meaning to this synchronization ambition.
Anton, Fedyashin, they may have talked about manufacturing policy, but of course the issue that overshadowed these talks is the conflict in Ukraine, and there appeared to be some movement on that because President Biden said afterwards that he's now prepared to meet with President Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, if the Russian leader is prepared to end the invasion. Biden said he would only do so in consultation with U.S. NATO allies. What did you make of that?
Well, first of all, it's a departure from the formula that we've been hearing for several months now, which is no discussion of Ukraine without Ukraine. Clearly, according to President Biden himself, this was one of the central issues during the discussions today. So the West is slowly beginning to change its position very carefully, very diplomatically. The Ukraine conflict, Anand, is both a concentrator and a catalyst of many issues that have been brewing for several decades on our planet, including within the Western alliance itself. President Macron had referred to the changing world order. He's absolutely right about that. The conceptual question that I hope that he and Joe Biden discussed today was how to manage it. I hope they didn't waste terribly much time discussing about reversing it, because I think that train has left the station. But the question is how to manage it. And so I see from the statements of Western politicians over the past few months two sort of broad camps. One has been coming most consistently out of Washington and London also, and that's bloc discipline and sanctions. That's one way to approach this crisis, and it may yet work. If you're a continental European, however, I think things look a bit more nuanced and complicated, because the other alternative is diplomacy. But that means embracing complexity. Michael, I agree with most of what Michael said earlier, but let me add one of the reasons that I think Macron was invited. Of all of the European leaders, Macron has been most vocal in calling for European strategic autonomy and even economic autonomy, in a sense. And so far, for all the sanctions that have been leveled on Russia, the boomerang effect has been so devastating for European economies because they're now trapped between the vice of American protectionism, to use a broad and at least short term for the Inflation Reduction Act and chips and everything else, and then the catastrophic blowback of European sanctions against Russia, the most serious being the energy prices in Europe. And I don't see how the Europeans are going to try to chart a new course for an industrial, advanced, developed, highly technological future when gas and oil prices make producing things in Europe much more expensive, and the Europeans are already complaining. Thierry Breton, Bruno Le Maire, even Habeck, Robert Habeck, the economy minister of Germany, is complaining about the fact that the Americans are creating favorable conditions for high-tech and green energy companies to come over to the United States, and the economic trend in Europe, because you need gas and oil and energy to produce all of these products, the trend in Europe is going in the opposite direction. I think that's what the meat of the discussion was. But again, it does come back to Ukraine, and especially the sanctions around it.
Right. Aaron Mattei, about a week ago, Politico, the political news site, ran a piece saying, and I'm quoting it said, 9 months after invading Ukraine, Vladimir Putin is beginning to fracture the West. In fact, the headline in that article was, Europe accuses US of profiting from war. It said top European officials are furious with the Biden administration and now accuse the USA of making a fortune from the war. I mean, we have, as Anton just told us, seen what's happened to several European economies. Do you think this meeting is going to go some way towards repairing that kind of damage?
I don't think it can. There's a reality that before this war, Europe relied very heavily on Russian gas. And one achievement of powerful people inside the U.S. who wanted to curb that of this war was to cut that off. And just to make sure, we saw the explosion of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline in case Germany got any funny ideas about trying to restore ties with Russia. And we don't know for sure who blew up that pipeline. But the fact that there's been so little interest in exploring the question suggests to me that the culprit was likely somebody from inside the NATO alliance. And I have my eye on the U.S., but who knows? And we also have, The Economist recently came out with an estimate saying that in excess of 147,000 people could die in Europe this winter if energy prices stay at their level. And so all of this is a consequence of Europe being forced to cut itself off from Russian energy, and no amount of diplomatic niceties between Macron and Biden, no matter what their personal friendship is, I think can repair that. I think Europe's put itself in a very dangerous position, and that is about to be realized as we enter into winter.
Anton, just one point. If the goal of President Putin is indeed to drive a wedge in the transatlantic alliance, is he succeeding?
I don't think that's entirely his goal, Anand, because he never had to work terribly hard to set it. The decision to go into Ukraine, which has been disastrous, of course, speaks for itself. It actually brought the West together. But all of these fissures are the result of the Western sanctions. Yeah. Let's remember that the EU was created in order to create a bloc to increase Europe's collective bargaining power and to make it a stronger competitor, a bloc competitor on the world stage. Mm-hmm. But over the past 8 months, we've seen the EU sort of start drifting towards a coercive economic mechanism where its policies in the pursuit of punishing Russia has actually so far punished the EU much more severely. And we've got the IMF figures and the energy prices to prove that. Will this change in the future? Will the long-term effects be poor for Russia? Maybe. But so far, the sanctions have not achieved what they were supposed to achieve to stop the war in Ukraine, and they've devastated the European economies.
Michael O'Hanlon, given the wide range of challenges that European countries are now facing, those challenges that were just outlined by Anton and by Aaron Mattei, were you surprised that in that joint statement that was released after the meeting here in Washington, there was nothing specific about diplomacy to end this conflict?
Well, there was explicit repudiation of the idea that we would pressure Ukraine to compromise anytime soon or even indefinitely. So in that sense, it did come up, and it came up in a very negative way. There was no interest by either Macron or Biden. And in fact, if I could add a point, I've been admiring and enjoying the commentary from my co-panelists, but in the last few minutes, there's been this implication that Europe is suffering even worse than Russia economically, which I don't think is mathematically true. But even more so, there's been this implication that Europe doesn't really want to punish Russia. They're just doing it because Washington's telling them to. No one quite put it that way. But let me just say, my European contacts are as upset and abhorred by what Russia has done to Ukraine as any American I know. And they feel very strongly that Russia must be punished, even if there's no guarantee that the punishment will end the war anytime soon. And to give further credit to European friends, they're the ones absorbing the refugee flows from Ukraine. And yes, they also are running the greater risks than we here on this side of the Atlantic economically. But they're willing to do it because they are so deeply offended by what Vladimir Putin has done to disturb a peace in Europe that previously had existed for decades after the Europeans themselves experienced the worst 2 wars in their history in the first half of the 20th century. And Europeans don't ever want to go back to that. So let's be adamantly clear on this point. Europeans and Americans are united in opposing Putin. And on that point, I don't think there's a lot of room for light. Now, yes, Putin would like to divide us. And yes, there are tensions. But I think the recent discussion here fails to appreciate just how much Europeans oppose Putin.
Okay, Joav, Toker, let's look at the situation in France. Inflation in France is currently running at around 7.7%. That's for the month of November. Growth in 2021 in France was 6.8%, but this year the projection is 2.6%. That is quite a drop. And the IMF has just released a statement warning that global economic growth is likely to dip below 2%. It blamed much of that slow growth, that anemic growth, on the Ukraine conflict. So what is the feeling in Europe? I mean, is there deep unhappiness in Europe with the continuation of this war?
There are worries, and these are fully justified. But I'll just surf on what has been said right now, right before my intervention. I think that if you look at it through geostrategic prism, and you are situated indeed in Washington or in Beijing, or even for that matter in Moscow, you don't see it the way Europeans do. And the meaning of what has happened in late February this year with a Russian invasion into Ukraine has so much meaning and takes so many elements in European common history, common reflexes, and common references, that you can't just bring all that down to the speculations which are done right now and just in a justified way regarding to what extent would Germany suffer, to what extent would France suffer, to what extent would Italians suffer more than the Spanish, etc. Although these are playing a role, and the Europeans have always been traditionally, right from the very beginning of the launch of this very peculiar political adventure, which is the EU, which has right now 27 members of sovereign countries, big and small, of varied history and traditions. And they are trying to operate in a way which is not a federal way, which is working up institutions and precedents and trying to make something coherent out of it. Now, not only this is complicated and has no precedent in world history, now it is trying to go on in this situation under the pressure of the war, which is taking place about 2 hours of a plane ride from Paris, where I'm sitting here, and Paris is rather on the western edge of the European continent. So one should keep that in mind, including in moments in which you're trying to figure out to what extent would a branch of the economy in France or in Belgium or in Austria might suffer more or less come winter.
Aaron Mate, do you believe that the sentiment in the United States and in Europe, insofar as Russia is concerned, is very similar, that they both feel the same way about what has happened in Ukraine?
I think Europe, in terms of its leadership, faces a problem in that they've been very subordinate to the U.S. for many years and have basically outsourced their security to Washington, which then puts them in a very difficult position when Washington essentially gives orders. And recall that, for example, the effort to kill the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which I think was a benefit to Europe, it supplied cheap energy or it would have supplied cheap energy to Europe had it been allowed to be operational, was deeply opposed by the U.S., which tried very hard to stop it, which sanctioned it under Trump, and then under Biden, he relaxed those sanctions. But he did promise that if Russia invades Ukraine, with the German chancellor standing at his side, said, we will stop it no matter what. And I think Germany, like other European countries, has not had the political will to stand up to the U.S., and I think that's put it in a very bad position. And let me say, just to respond to a point earlier, yes, European leaders have been united with the U.S. against Russia when it comes to the Ukraine war. But I wouldn't say the same thing for the European population. We've seen demonstrations in many European countries drawing thousands and tens of thousands of people. And I do think that will worsen as they're the ones who feel the impact of this proxy war going on through winter, which stands to punish ordinary people who are facing very high energy bills and stand to lose power as a result. So I don't think the priorities of European citizens are the same as those of leaders in Washington.
Okay, Joav Toker, very briefly, please, if you could, are European leaders out of sync with public opinion in their countries?
To some extent, yes. To some extent, not. This is normal. This is not an exception. When you look at other layers of internal and foreign policies of European governments, of course, the gamble on the Moscow side is indeed trying to work on that side of swift. But this is not necessarily the case, and Western powers, including in Europe, including small and big ones, have already proven in the past that they are able of mobilizing common energy facing serious and challenge, which is the case.
Right, Anton Fedyashin, among the many reasons we've heard about why the U.S. wasn't so keen to end this war very quickly is that Americans want Europeans to lessen their dependence on Russian energy. Is that policy working? Because we've already seen differences between the United States and Europe, for instance, on imposing a price cap on Russian energy. They can't even agree on the price.
Right. So the price cap question, of course, is still open, although officially we have about 4 days until it's supposed to kick in, which is the 5th of December, and that's on oil. We'll see if that works out. There's plenty of disagreements. But in general, I would say that not only is the American policy to decouple Europe from oil succeeding, but I would say that it has succeeded. It's just that the costs of that are going to be enormous for Europe. And sort of to reflect and react on what Michael had said earlier, regardless of how anyone feels about the invasion of Ukraine and the need to punish Russia, the economic consequences of this for the Europeans will be enormous. It is worth remembering that part of the reason for the West European economic miracle of the late 60s, 70s, and thereafter was cheap Soviet and then later cheap Russian gas, long-term contracts. Well below spot market prices.
All right.
The European Union started moving towards spot markets before this catastrophe began, but now that the Europeans are planning to cut themselves off from Russian gas and then oil, they're going to be paying a lot more money for them. And ultimately, again, listen, people often forget that everything that human civilization makes depends on the cost of energy. And so products will cost much more coming from Europe.
Right.
It will make them much less competitive versus the U.S.
Okay, Anton, I just want to get to Michael Hanlon very quickly. Michael, unfortunately, I've only got about 30 seconds for your response to what you just heard.
Well, I like the points. I think it's very fair to say that, first of all, there's going to be a lot of political pressure as people go through a tough winter, and that's not always fair. I don't know if tens of thousands of demonstrators proves that populations are going to turn against their governments. I think it's going to be a little bit more complex than that, and sometimes governments will survive, but people are going to be unhappy. We're in a bad place in world history right now. So make no mistake about that. That's going to affect everything.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.